The hardest part wasn't finding the enemy, it was knowing who wasn't one. June 22nd, 1969. A small hamlet on the edge of Quang Ngai province. I was a captain by then, commanding a rifle company, 118 men, organized into 3 platoons, supported by 2 M60 machine guns and a 60mm mortar section staged a few kilometers behind us. On paper, it was overwhelming force. In reality, it felt like we were walking blind. The village appeared ordinary enough. Bamboo huts, cooking fires, chickens scattering as we approached, women carrying water, old men sitting in the shade, watching us without expression. No uniforms, no weapons, no obvious threat. That was the problem. Vietnam wasn't a place where the enemy always wore a rifle. Sometimes he wore sandals, sometimes he carried rice, sometimes he waved as you passed. Our orders were clear: search, question, move on. Win hearts and minds. Avoid civilian casualties. Engage only if fired upon. Those words sounded clean back at headquarters. Out here, they felt useless. We entered in a loose cordon, rifles down but ready. M16A1s held at chest level, fingers disciplined. M1 helmets dull green against the sun. ERDL jungle uniforms soaked with sweat before we'd crossed half the village. Every face watched us. Every face looked calm. That was worse than fear. I split the company. First platoon secured the northern huts, second took the center, third stayed mobile, ready to respond. The mortars were on standby. Artillery was available if things went bad, but artillery doesn't ask who's innocent. I walked through the village slowly, eyes moving from hands to faces to the ground. I wasn't looking for weapons. I was looking for hesitation. One man bowed his head too quickly. Another avoided eye contact altogether. A teenager stood perfectly still, jaw tight, as if waiting for something. None of it was proof. All of it was suspicious. This was the enemy's advantage. They didn't need to fight us openly. They only needed to blend in well enough that we'd never be sure when the fight had already begun. A search team found nothing in the first huts. Rice, clothing, family items. The kinds of things you couldn't bomb without admitting you were wrong about why you were here. Then one of my sergeants pulled me aside. "Sir," he said quietly, "these people know we're coming." I asked him why. "No surprise," he said. "No fear. They're waiting." Waiting for what? That question sat heavy in my chest. We questioned the village elder through an interpreter. He answered politely, too politely, said there were no Viet Cong here, said no one had seen fighters in weeks, said the village wanted peace. I had heard those same words in 3 different provinces, and every time we were fired on later. The war here wasn't about firepower. It was about uncertainty, about forcing young soldiers to decide on instinct who lived and who might kill them later. That pressure broke men faster than bullets. As we prepared to leave, a woman crossed the path ahead of one of my squads. She carried a basket. Nothing else. No visible weapon. The squad froze. No one knew what to do. If she was a civilian, stopping her would be wrong. If she wasn't, letting her pass could get someone killed. I watched the soldiers' faces. These weren't rookies anymore. They had been shot at. They had returned fire. But this hesitation, this was different. This was the war without rules. I ordered them to let her pass. She didn't look back. 10 minutes later, a booby trap detonated on the trail we just cleared behind us. No casualties, just a message. They had been watching, they had been waiting, and they had chosen when to remind us. As we moved out of the village, I realized something that no training had prepared me for. We weren't fighting an army. We were fighting a population we couldn't separate from the battlefield. And every decision we made, every moment of restraint or suspicion was being studied. In Vietnam, not knowing who the enemy wasn't a flaw in the war. It was the strategy. We marched for another hour through low brush and rice paddies, the village disappearing behind us like it had never existed. No gunfire, no pursuit, just heat, insects, and the steady crunch of boots in mud. That silence was never comforting. I kept replaying the scene in my head, the woman with the basket, the elder's calm answers, the detonation timed just late enough to avoid blood. It wasn't an ambush, it was instruction. They were teaching us something. By late afternoon, we reached a tree line overlooking a narrow trail junction. Intelligence had marked it as a frequent transit point, not for units, too exposed, but for individuals. Couriers, spotters, sometimes assassins. We set an observation halt. 3rd platoon took overwatch positions. 1st and 2nd established a perimeter. The men dropped to one knee, then to the dirt, grateful for even a few minutes without moving. That's when the doubt started creeping in. One of my corporals whispered, "Sir, how do you tell?" I knew what he meant. How do you tell who's a civilian and who's waiting for the right moment? I didn't answer right away because the truth was ugly. You don't tell, you guess, and you live with it. An hour passed, then another. Footsteps on the trail. A man appeared from the trees, walking alone, mid-40s, thin, straw hat, no visible weapon. He stopped when he saw us, raised his hands slowly, eyes wide with fear that looked genuine enough. Too genuine. My radio operator looked at me. Everyone was waiting for a signal. I stepped forward, keeping distance, called for the interpreter. The man said he was a farmer, said he was returning home, said he had nothing to do with the fighting. His voice shook, his hands trembled. Everything about him said civilian. Everything about the situation said trap. I searched him, found nothing but a cloth pouch with dried rice and a folded piece of paper, blank at first glance. I almost handed it back. Then I noticed the tiny pinprick holes along the edge, a code. Old method, coordinates pressed through paper layers. He wasn't carrying a weapon, he was carrying information. I looked at his face again. He wouldn't meet my eyes now. We detained him. No shouting, no rough handling, just zip ties and silence. As we moved out, I felt the shift in the men behind me, a mix of relief and something darker. They had been right to be suspicious. That knowledge didn't comfort them, it hardened them. Over the next weeks, it got worse. Children relaying messages by memorized routes, women hiding ammunition in cooking pots, elderly men serving as early warning systems, tapping pipes or moving livestock in patterns we didn't recognize until it was too late. No uniforms, no ranks, no clear front line. Every village was neutral until it wasn't. Rules of engagement became mental gymnastics. Fire only when fired upon. Confirm hostile intent. Avoid escalation. But hostile intent in Vietnam rarely announced itself. It waited. One night, a squad was hit by sniper fire from a tree line near a hamlet we had cleared twice already. The shooter vanished. No trail. No witnesses. The next morning, the villagers swore they'd heard nothing. I believed them, and that scared me more than if they'd lied. Because it meant the system worked. Everyone knew their role, everyone knew when to speak, and when silence was the weapon. By the end of that tour, my men didn't look at faces anymore. They looked at hands, at movement, at timing. Trust became a liability. Suspicion became survival. When people back home asked what the enemy was like, they expected stories about firefights and jungle battles. I never knew how to explain that the real enemy wasn't the man with the rifle. It was the uncertainty. The constant pressure of knowing that at any moment the line between civilian and combatant could disappear, and that the decision you made in that split second would follow you long after the war was over. In Vietnam, you didn't just fight an enemy. You fought your own judgment. That pressure didn't ease with time. It tightened. Weeks later, during a sweep operation south of the river, we entered another village at first light. Same routine, same faces emerging from doorways, same careful smiles, chickens scattering, smoke rising from cook fires like nothing in the world was wrong. But everything felt wrong. I noticed how quickly they had woken up, how few children there were, how the dogs didn't bark. Someone had warned them. We set up security and began questioning. Answers were polite, consistent, too consistent. Every man claimed the same occupation. Every woman repeated the same story about the night before. It was rehearsed, like a play we'd already seen performed somewhere else. I walked through the village slowly, letting my boots scrape the dirt, listening. Behind one hut, I found a fresh footprint that didn't match civilian sandals. Combat boot tread, faded but unmistakable. Recently covered, poorly. I said nothing. 10 minutes later, the first shot rang out. Not close, not far, just enough to be heard. Then another. Then silence. No one ran. No one screamed. The villagers froze exactly where they were, eyes down, hands visible. They knew what was happening. They always did. We took cover, scanning rooftops, tree lines, windows. Nothing. The shots had come from outside the village, drawing our attention outward. That's when the grenade went off. It wasn't meant to kill. It was meant to scatter. Dirt and fragments ripped through the center of the village square, forcing my men to break formation. That was the real attack. From nowhere and everywhere, small arms fire erupted. Short bursts, disciplined, precise, not random villagers, trained fighters who had blended in seconds earlier. They didn't stand and fight. They struck and vanished. When it was over, 2 of my men were wounded, one badly. The attackers were gone, melted back into huts, tunnels, tree lines, into the civilian population itself. We searched, found nothing. No weapons, no bodies, no proof. Just blood on the dirt and faces that looked genuinely afraid now. That night, as we evacuated the wounded, one of my youngest soldiers sat beside me shaking. He wasn't crying, he was past that. He asked me quietly, "Sir, if everyone helps them, what are we supposed to do?" I didn't have an answer that wouldn't break him. Because the truth was this: we weren't fighting an army hiding among civilians. We were fighting a society at war, a system where roles shifted by the hour, where a farmer at noon could be a scout at dusk, where neutrality was temporary and survival depended on participation. The next morning, orders came down to increase patrols, tighten control, show presence. The logic was simple: pressure breaks networks, but pressure also breaks people. Every checkpoint became a test, every interaction a calculation. Who hesitated too long, who spoke too smoothly, who avoided eye contact, and who held it too firmly. I watched good men grow distant. Jokes disappeared. Letters from home went unread. They weren't afraid of dying. They were afraid of choosing wrong. Years later, long after I left Vietnam, I still see those villages in my sleep. Still hear the quiet before the first shot. Still feel the weight of decisions made with incomplete information and irreversible consequences. Because the hardest thing about that war wasn't the jungle or the heat or even the enemy. It was never knowing who you were really looking at and knowing that eventually that uncertainty would change you, whether you wanted it to or not. That uncertainty followed us everywhere after that. A month later, during a night patrol along a dirt road we'd already walked a dozen times, we stopped near a cluster of huts marked cleared on the map. Intelligence said the area was quiet, low activity, no recent contact. Maps lied more often than people did. A single lantern burned inside one hut. Too late for dinner. Too early for sleep. I told the squad to halt and listen. Crickets. Distant water. Nothing else. Then the lantern went out. That was the signal. Shots cracked from both sides of the road. Not loud, not wild, controlled bursts, fired low. We hit the ground, returning fire into darkness we couldn't see through. Muzzle flashes blinked once, twice, then vanished. They knew our spacing. They knew our response time. They knew exactly how long to stay before disappearing. When it ended, there were no casualties. That almost made it worse. We searched again. Same result as always. Empty huts, cold cooking pots, a child's shirt folded neatly on a wooden bench. No weapons, no trails, only one thing stood out. Fresh handprints on the hut walls, muddy, overlapping, at adult height. Too many for one family. Too many for civilians just living their lives. That night, no one slept. The men lay with rifles across their chests, eyes open, listening for footsteps that never came. Every sound felt intentional. Every shadow felt like a decision waiting to be made. In the early hours before dawn, I overheard 2 soldiers whispering. One asked if it would be easier if the enemy wore uniforms. The other didn't answer. I knew what he was thinking. Uniforms create distance. They make choices cleaner. Here, nothing was clean. A week later, we detained an old man at a checkpoint. He smiled constantly, nodded, answered every question politely. His papers were perfect, too perfect, newly printed, no creases. I let him go that afternoon. One of our supply convoys hit an ambush less than a mile down the road. I never knew if it was him. That was the poison of it. The war didn't just attack your body, it attacked your sense of certainty, your ability to judge, your trust in your own instincts. You started second-guessing everything, your orders, your reactions, your morality. By the end of my tour, I had stopped trying to separate civilians from fighters in my mind. I treated every encounter like it could turn violent in a second, not because I wanted to, because the war taught me to. When I finally boarded the plane home, I thought distance would fix it, that once the jungle disappeared beneath the clouds, the tension would fade. It didn't. In grocery stores, I watched hands. On sidewalks, I scanned faces. Sudden noises made my muscles lock before my thoughts caught up. The war had followed me. Not as memories of firefights or explosions, but as a constant question I could never fully answer. Who is safe? Who is pretending? And how much does that question cost you before you stop asking it at all? It took years before I understood that the question never really leaves you. Back home, people asked what Vietnam was like. I gave them safe answers: heat, mud, long patrols, bad food. I never told them about the way suspicion rewired my brain, how the war trained me to see threat not in weapons, but in normality. Because that was the real lesson. The battlefield didn't announce itself. In Vietnam, danger didn't always come from the jungle or from men in black pajamas carrying rifles. Sometimes it came from a smile that lingered a second too long, from a village that emptied too quickly, from a woman who asked too many questions about where we were heading next. And sometimes it came from nowhere at all. I remember a boy, maybe 12 years old, who followed our patrol for half a kilometer, barefoot, laughing, mimicking our steps. The men relaxed around him. Someone tossed him a candy bar. He stopped walking. We kept moving. 30 seconds later, an explosion tore the road apart behind us. A command detonated charge, perfectly timed. The boy was gone. No one said a word for the rest of the patrol. That was when I realized the war had no clear edges. There was no front line you crossed, no moment where you could tell yourself, now I'm safe. The front line was everywhere and nowhere. As a commander, that knowledge was poison. If you trust too much, you get your men killed. If you trust too little, you become something you don't recognize. Every decision sits between those two failures. I gave orders that still wake me up at night. Extra searches, longer detentions, more aggressive posture in villages that might have been innocent. I told myself it was necessary. Sometimes it probably was. Sometimes I'm not so sure. Years later, when reports and histories talked about winning hearts and minds, I felt a bitter laugh rise in my chest. Hearts and minds require clarity. This war erased it. By the time my tour ended, I wasn't afraid of ambushes anymore. I wasn't even afraid of dying. I was afraid of what the uncertainty had turned us into. The war didn't end for me on the day I left Vietnam. It ended slowly in fragments. Each time I relearned how to trust a stranger, how to walk past someone without measuring distance and intent, how to stop scanning hands. Some men never managed that. When people ask now why the war was so hard to fight, I don't talk about terrain or tactics. I tell them this: in Vietnam, the hardest enemy wasn't the one shooting at you. It was the doubt that followed you everywhere, quiet, invisible, and impossible to defeat.